While America takes a long overdue look at racial disparities in the criminal justice system, it should also reflect on the racial impact of other institutions. Occupational licensing laws can and have been used to protect incumbents from competition, and can and have been used to restrict new entrants based on race, sex, sexual orientation, or religion. Medical licensing laws are no exception. The American Medical Association was founded in 1847, a time period of free trade in medicine. The group was created in part to raise standards of medical practice through licensing. The AMA promoted regulations aimed at improving healthcare quality, but one practical effect was to decrease the supply of medical practitioners and allow the development of a system of discrimination against aspiring black doctors. Join us as we take a brief look at the history of medical licensing laws in the United States, one that initially excluded black medical professionals, and how this history led to a disparate quality of medical care in communities of color today.
So we're talking about the past, not the present. But it's an important lesson, though. At this moment in our cultural history, where we're suddenly becoming much more aware of racism, and we're wanting to rectify the disparities that were created by racist policies in the past, it's important to realize that occupational licensing laws can also fall prey to people with racist intentions and can contribute to the racial disparities, which they actually did in the case of the provision of medicine for a great many years in this country. And we're still playing catch up in certain regions of this country now that we've corrected those policies.
After emancipation, suddenly African Americans could enter professions which they hadn't been able to do, hadn't even been able to get an education for. The question was, could they become physicians or lawyers or teachers or ministers or whatever? As physicians, for the most part, you had to go to medical school. Trouble was that most African Americans lived in the South after emancipation, and no school in the South would accept a black student. So what happened shortly after emancipation, some of the missionary groups that came south to teach African Americans basic education also established some medical schools. The most famous one is Howard University, which was founded in 1868, and it provided education for both white and black students, as well as for men and women. It was a very liberal-looking school. Other schools were also established. Those schools, for the most part, were very poorly funded, had difficulty getting instructors, and for the most part did not last very long. So there were opportunities for medical education, but they were very limited. The schools only had a small amount of money to pay their instructors, and there were no laboratory facilities. It was difficult to get cadavers for dissection, all kinds of problems. There were many barriers, financial as well as educational, to a student starting out, getting an education, and then finally getting an MD degree at the end. Starting in the 1870s and 80s, as medicine became more scientific and people began to trust medicine more, and this is a slow process, states began to introduce exams or the graduation from an approved medical school to get a license, and then you could legally practice in that state. It depended on the state whether a student would be able to get a license or not. It wasn't until 1904, when the Council on Medical Education was established, that the Journal of the American Medical Association published the board scores for each state, and they listed where the student went to school, where they got their MD degree. So there's the link between the AMA and licensure. In a sense, what the AMA was doing was saying, if you went to a school where most students didn't pass the licensure exam, then that's not a very good school. So the states, by then, now this is in 1904 and beyond, began to notice that the states wouldn't allow students to even take the state licensure exam in that state if they didn't graduate from a school that the state accepted the AMA's ruling about, saying this wasn't a good school.
So the American Medical Association was at the forefront of advocating for policies and standards to be set into place for medical school accreditation as well as the licensing for states. And this had a significant impact in reducing the number of licensed physicians who were legally able to practice in the United States. In addition to having a general reduction in the number of licensed providers, the AMA commissioned what is called the Flexner report in 1910, which significantly reduced the number of accredited medical schools in the United States. And medical schools for Black students, HBC, historically Black colleges and universities, at that time had 7 medical schools. And after the Flexner report graded those schools and gave them different grades, only 2 of the 7 HBCU medical schools had grades of A and B, and were allowed to remain in existence following the conclusion of the Flexner report. So not only did the AMA advocate for policies and processes that reduced the general number of physicians, but it had a significant reduction in African American physicians by reducing the number of accredited medical schools in the United States that were open to training Black doctors. So many medical schools prohibited the admission of Black doctors. So that's why the Flexner report was so pivotal, because African American medical schools were primarily the only place where Black doctors could train. And so currently Black doctors only account for 5% of the US practicing physicians. And largely this can be attributable to many of the policies that the AMA established. And as you know, the pipeline for any profession is very important, and not enough resources have gone towards reversing the impact of those policies that were put into place. So despite the AMA offering an apology, they have contributed some resources to righting the wrong of those policies, but not enough resources have gone into place. Even today, we know that many board exams, the cutoff scores are arbitrary, and the scores are oftentimes used to determine the entry for not just going to medical school and residency, but also physicians practicing in subspecialties with higher incomes. And we also know that African Americans on average score lower on these examinations. And so this has resulted in a lower number of not just physicians, but also Black physicians going into specialty care.
Racism placed obstacles in the way of African American doctors, but it wasn't that the AMA established or promoted licensing to restrict African American doctors. The AMA promoted licensing to restrict the entry of as many people as possible into its field, to kind of protect doctors from competition and protect them from the production of too many licensed physicians. That was the goal of licensing. It just so happens that in certain parts of the country, racism intersected with licensing laws to have a negative impact, to have a disparate impact on minorities. All state licensing boards required an internship after medical school. And since many of the internship programs, particularly in the Deep South, would not accept blacks into their training program. Blacks who graduated medical school were having difficulty meeting the licensing requirements to practice medicine in a lot of those states, which also negatively impacted the rural black population in those states who already were underserved by the healthcare system. Many of these doctors wanted to go and practice in those communities, but they couldn't get a license because they couldn't get into an internship program.
And so since the American Medical Association was founded, they did not have explicit policies barring African American and Black physicians. What they allowed was for state local chapters to develop their own policies for admitting physicians. And unfortunately, many Southern states had explicit policies that initially barred women and Black individuals. Women were later able to be admitted, and the AMA explicitly came out with policies and revisions to its medical code of ethics that barred women from being discriminated against. But they did not go forward and weren't as vocal on eliminating discrimination for Black doctors. And so since the 1870s, 1860s, Black doctors were going to the AMA and were requesting to be a part of the AMA, but they were refused membership. And so in 1895, the National Medical Association was created to serve as the collective body for Black physicians in the United States. It was open to non-Black physicians as well, but really any physicians who were interested in caring for underserved populations and communities. And to this day, the NMA is still in existence and is the leading voice for parity and justice for the collective body of Black physicians. The National Medical Association provides a number of resources, mentoring and support for African American students and Black students from underrepresented backgrounds. So since its inception, mentoring and support for other minority physicians has been at the forefront. Not only has the National Medical Association been an active player in advocating for equal rights for Black doctors, but they have also been an active player for fighting for equality and integration of hospitals and resources for underserved populations. Many of the policies and regulations that the American Medical Association advocated for were done to improve the care and quality of the medical practice in the United States. Unfortunately, these laws and regulations also reduce the number of available and licensed medical providers and directly have resulted in the number of workforce shortages and underserved communities that we have today.
Probably 90% of doctors don't know about the racist history of the AMA because it's not that way anymore. But there's a whole lot of racial disparities right now in the number of Black doctors proportionate to the population and the amount of doctors serving rural, underserved Black communities compared to the number that could be. And this all is the result of people who are racist taking advantage of the fact that these licensing using the licensing barriers to deny entry. And it's important for people to realize that licensing laws in general are designed to restrict new entrants into the field, to restrict competition. They do little in the way of actually providing any safety to the general public. And most of the time, when licensing boards are established, it's the incumbents who want the licensing boards established, not the consumers. Yet they say, we're just doing this to protect the consumers. So I'm pointing out that not only is that actually restrictive and it hurts consumers by denying them choice and actually sometimes protects unsafe licensed licensed practitioners, but in addition, it falls prey to people who have sinister intentions. I mean, licensing boards per se are not racist, but racist people could end up influencing decisions of licensing boards. And that's just important to keep in mind, that whenever we allow the government to get in the business of regulating peaceful, consensual activity, there's all sorts of unintended consequences that can happen because decisions are now no longer in the realm of voluntary human interaction, but they're in the realm of the political.
When governments regulate peaceful, voluntary human activity, no matter how well-intentioned, that regulation can become a tool for interests with less than honorable intentions. Licensing requirements are hurdles to success for traditionally marginalized communities, and those requirements can leave the well-being of minorities up to the whims of federal, state, and local regulators.